A lot of men go into fatherhood wanting to be present, involved, and supportive. And then the baby arrives, and something strange can happen. They're there, they care, they're trying, but they don't always feel like they're in the driver's seat. Norma Barrett is a public health researcher at Deakin University who spent years looking at what actually happens to fathers during the transition to parenthood. She kept finding men who wanted to do more, be more, but quietly ended up stepping back, deferring to their partner, suppressing their own needs, sliding into a role nobody explicitly chose. She calls it passenger parenting. We talk about why that happens, what dad guilt actually looks like, how men navigate their own mental health while trying to hold everything together, and the gap between the equal partnership couples think they've signed up for and the traditional roles they can easily drift into. This is a conversation about fathers, but really it's about families, relationships, and the person early parenthood can shape you into before you realise what's happening. What drew you to researching fathers and the transition to parenthood in the first place?
It was kind of unintentional, actually. So I was approached by a local city council to find out a bit more about their first-time parents groups. At that time, there was somebody that was leading the services, and they wanted to know more about engagement with those parenting services and why fathers weren't engaging with it. And so I designed a small project, interviewed some parents, and actually it led to kind of a path into thinking and researching parenting a bit more. And in the meantime, I became a parent myself as well in the middle of all of this. So it was a bit more meaningful for me. And so that's how I ended up looking at transition to parenthood, in particular, like those early parenting years.
Cool. When you were looking into the services that were provided, what sort of, things stood out in terms of, well, from both mothers and fathers, but predominantly the sort of the becoming a father aspect?
Yeah, well, a bunch of different things cropped up, and some of them are quite obvious, and some of them are probably things we might not have thought about. But with fathers not attending the service, well, up until very recently, and we still kind of use the term mums group, that's still very strong. And so while we're trying to kind of push away from that, and actually there's been more movement, I think, away from that since I conducted that research, which was a while ago now. I think it was 2018. Still kind of colloquially, that's what we call them, like in my mom's group this or my mom's group that. And straight away, that's like shuts the doors to a lot of people, particularly, your average dad doesn't think any further about that once it's labelled as a mum's group, and it goes no further. And a couple of other practical things, like the invitations normally come through the health system. They're normally addressed to the mother because they're on the health record. And so the mother's kind of naturally most engaged with all of these things at the beginning of parenting. And that starts even before they go into hospital, because obviously they have to deal with the medical checkups and things. And that continues on from, say, for example, dealing with their GP to maybe, typical situation where mother would receive some sort of hospital care or typically give birth in hospital, down through the maternal child health nurse and so on. So and first-time parents groups are the same. They kind of use those pathways to link people in. And so it's kind of up to the mothers in a lot of instances to actually say to the dads, in a mom-dad family, hey, did you want to go to this as well? And that doesn't always happen, and it's not necessarily the mother's fault, but that's kind of the pattern of things, how they tend to start off. And that can kind of perpetuate a bit as well. So it can make it difficult to kind of tap into those social networks and connections that are engineered for mothers and less so for fathers. Yeah.
And I guess usually the mother obviously has at least a decent chunk of time off initially after having the baby, whereas the father typically goes back to work, within a few weeks usually. Mm-hmm. So I guess that makes it a bit trickier too when a lot of those services are sort of throughout the day during the week at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah. So that was another kind of classic one that cropped up. Often the meetings would be during the day, during work hours, even though there was some suggestion that even on weekends it's kind of seen as precious time, particularly if one parent's working full time, that they really kind of want that family time or maybe a bit freer and not have to feel like they have other commitments. But yeah, look, you're absolutely right. Like the way things get divvied up, it's typically the mom. In heterosexual couples that will get, a chunk of time off, and they need recovery time obviously from birth, and also for things like breastfeeding. There's lots of practical reasons why that should happen, but we are getting better as well. Like there's more statutory time for fathers now, so people who can afford to kind of take that government payment and take a bit of extra time. And a lot of workplaces as well are giving additional time on top of that statutory time as well. And I think Australia was quite behind. I remember when I moved here first in 2010, I was quite shocked at how minimal maternity leave and also like parental leave, I suppose more broadly, was given out here and in Ireland. And that's not to say that Ireland's services or ways of doing things are better, because there's pros and cons to every country, but we were a bit more progressive, and Australia has come on in leaps and bounds in that regard actually in recent years. So that's good to see. There's probably more to be done, but yeah.
Okay. What sort of benefits are in Ireland or were in Ireland?
Well, maternity leaves typically are much longer, and standard maternity leaves will be much longer. So those, the allowances and workplaces, a lot of them, while here it was selective workplaces, but it's more broad, widespread in Ireland that you would have a large chunk of time off after having a baby, and also parental leave as well, and taking time off. Or taking unpaid leave, and all these sorts of things have been happening for a few decades in Ireland now, whereas it's relatively new kind of over the past decade or so in Australia. And I think it started with, there was that baby payment that kind of initially was at like $1,000 or something. I remember that being around when I was here, but the maternity and paternity and parental leaves more broadly being a bit thin on the ground. And people actually not realizing that in other countries it's done quite differently. I remember my sister-in-law was having her first baby shortly after I came here, and I was quite surprised actually at how little paid time she would get. But she wasn't surprised at all and thought it was perfectly okay. So that was normal. So, but I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, it's that huge. Like my sister-in-law lives over in Sweden now, and obviously the Scandinavian countries are quite ahead of with all that stuff. So I think they're a year paid leave for both parents. I'm pretty sure, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. Yeah, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what it is in Ireland at the moment. I don't think it's at that standard for dads. But yeah, they certainly have some allowances that are pretty good. But yes, Scandinavian countries are always the one that we point to when we're looking at the literature and we're comparing. And it's great to have countries that have tried making more allowances and giving more benefits, because then you can see how they pan out and how they work for them, and is there something to be learned from that, and what the pros and cons are. So it's really useful for countries like Australia and other developed countries to look at that. Yeah.
I was going to ask a bit later, but I may as well bring it in now. Obviously this is more of an opinion-based thing than probably your research found, but what would, in your opinion, sort of that more father-specific inclusive services do differently, or how do you think that could look to make things a bit more, positive?
Yeah, well, there's been a bit of growth in that space, and a lot of councils are trying to get something started, and a lot of agencies as well. And there's organisations that go out and do work with councils now to try and help them set up dad-friendly services and dad-specific services as well. But they're not standard. So when we think about the services that are there for for parenting more generally, and for mothers, they're universal services like the maternal child healthcare services. It goes under different names by different states, right? But in Victoria, that's what we call it. That has an equivalent service in every state in Australia. The first-time parents groups, they've been running for decades, and they will continue to run. These are all universal, but the dad services are a little bit more ad hoc in nature. So there's no kind of blanket approach to that. There's a lot of agencies that are trying different approaches and different things and learning from one another, but we're still at those kind of early stages. And I think there's a lot to be done with just general health services, actually, because if I think about my own personal experience, my husband, I've got two children, so a 7-year-old and 10-year-old, but they were grommets kids, they had issues with their ears and things when they were quite young. And I remember my husband taking one of them, I can't remember which one, to the doctor about their ears at one point on his day off, and I was at home working, and he got a referral for a hearing test, and it went through some organization or agency linked with hearing. I'm not really sure what the name of it is now off the top of my head, but I was really shocked at that time because through that appointment, he was asked, or he got sent some paperwork, or he completed the paperwork, that was it. And then the service contacted us and said, through his number actually, and said, I can't speak to you, I can only speak to the mother. And he said, I set up the appointment, and gave them his detail. And they said, no, we can't speak with you. And I was in the middle of teaching a class or doing something. I can't remember what I was doing, but I was busy. And, he comes in and he said, can you call these people and just talk to them about taking the next step of the appointment, like he was trying to progress it. And so I got through to them and I just explained to them, it's actually my husband that's organizing this. And, would you be happy to speak with him? And they said, no, we can't. It has to be the mother. And I was so shocked. And I remember doing parenting research at the time. And I said, look, I'm not trying to challenge you individually, but I'm just curious where that stance is coming from because I'm doing research in this space. Can you tell me a bit more about that? Like, is there a particular policy that you have in your where is this? So they referred me on to him. And so they got quite disgruntled with me. Which wasn't my intention. And they did refer me on to a manager and I explained to them, what's going on here? And they just really had no answer for me other than to say that's their policy and that's their way of doing things. And so my husband, who would arrange all the appointments, spoke to the doctor. I didn't even really know what had happened in the appointment because I was at home at work. This had all happened in one day. And so they were asking me questions that I didn't know the answers to. And then I was having to ask him and relay it on the phone. And I just thought, this is a bit ridiculous.
Yeah.
Why is he being excluded like this? It just seems totally unnecessary.
Yeah, yes, definitely.
Yeah. So the practical ways we manage things and speak to parents, this notion that we always have to identify who the primary caregiver is. I mean, that is in most households, I would say, open for debate pretty much. And some households there will be a primary carer, depending on the family setup and whether there's two parents involved or custody, all sorts of things would feed into that. But I think in a lot of households, you shouldn't have to label who's the primary because it doesn't really have meaning to a lot of people. And my house is probably a bit like that.
Yeah, I remember I've seen in the local where the sort of play group is near us, there's a few little the little notice board, there's a few little flyers that talk about a parent, like a father's sort of meetup or something, but like you said, it seems to be a lot more ad hoc and not really that structured, where it's just reaching out to people rather than being a service that feels like it's useful for everyone. So going on to some of the actual research and the sort of themes that you found, one of them was that a lot of the fathers you spoke to they volunteered that as well. They said they were ridiculously unprepared going into becoming a father. What was that? What was they actually unprepared for? Was it just the whole entirety of it, or was it sort of the practical tasks, the emotional load, relationship change? What did you find?
Oh, look, I think it was all of the above, really. And that was a quote, actually, ridiculously unprepared. And I remember one particular participant that was interviewed. He said to me, I knew I was preparing for this big thing, but I didn't really know what it was going to look like. I knew there was going to be a lot of change, but I didn't really appreciate the complexity of it or how mammoth this was going to be, kind of in every aspect of their life. And it kind of started with, I think a lot of them thought, parenting is going to be cool, I'm excited, I'm a little bit nervous. But actually it came from a place of a lot of them didn't realize how incredible it was going to be and how much it was going to change them and how much love comes with having a family. And that really kind of shook them then, because they realized that's actually flowing into how I view everything now, how I view work, how I spend time with my friends, how I manage my time, my relationship. And then, of course, the practical side of things being quite challenging as well. And it's challenging for everybody involved, but this sense of nothing could really prepare you for it until you were in it. But I feel like there was probably a few things, like when I've gone back and analysed a bunch of this information together, there was probably a few things they could have been a bit more prepared for. And that's through no fault of their own necessarily. But I think, you know, and myself included, I would put myself into this, we need to be more prepared for the conversations and actually realising that our picture of what it's going to be like when we're trying to divvy up work and family and responsibilities, what it starts at the outset could be very different to what it is once you're a few weeks, months, years into it. You know, it's constantly evolving. And I think you have to be kind of flexible in what your notions of what parenting is going to look like, because none of us are really totally ready for it, but we kind of need to appreciate that we need to be adaptable, right? And there's some practical things like the work example is a classic one. Conversations around feeding, you know, that was another one that cropped up. And I don't know if you've, you know, experienced any of this yourself, but, you know, breastfeeding, and it can be quite challenging. And you know, your parents are learning this new skill. And then for dads, you know, they're trying to help a parent who's learning this new skill and maybe are not sure about how to help or what to say or how much to say or not say, sometimes having concerns if, you know, there's any questions over if the baby is, you know, this term failing to thrive, or maybe just not generally getting on as well with feeding and waking as you know, one would hope. You know, how do they kind of navigate that in a way that's positive, and what's their place in that and their role in that? And there was some really interesting examples about it, Aidan, like where mothers are whisked away, and which is often the case after, you know, a labour. If there's been physical trauma, they might be whisked away to surgery to have some repairs done and that kind of thing. And the dad is actually, I mean, always pretty much, if it's a heterosexual couple, the dad will be handed the baby if the baby's well. And everybody focuses their attention on, you know, the mother who might be dealing with, you know, some bleeding or immediate things that need to be addressed. And suddenly the dad's in this immediate kind of driver's seat, as we, you know, talk about in the research. But and they're having to make decisions that they might not have discussed with their partner, like, okay, you're going to be in surgery for, and you know, this is not to scaremonger people, because not everybody has to have surgery, obviously. But, you know, sometimes complications crop up and it can take an extended period of time. And then people can be in recovery for a few hours. The baby may need to be fed. What's the decision with that? You know, is it okay to give them formula or not okay to give them formula? So I had one dad that described that in detail. And currently I'm looking at submissions to the New South Wales Inquiry into Birth Trauma. And it's very common that mothers are separated from their baby when these sorts of issues arise. And so I would say the dad that described that scenario to me is not alone. This is not an isolated event. So have you discussed with your partner, you know, how they would feel in that situation? Is it okay with you? Like that they just, you know, give some formula to get the baby across the interim period? Or is that a no-no? Do you want them to, you know, reassess hour by hour? Or, you know, are you a breastfeeding purist? What are your approaches and values? Are you going to be upset with me if I do this? Also, are you going to be upset with me if our baby is very hungry and they haven't been fed? Because a lot of people see those early decisions, and rightly so, around things like formula or how things are managed immediately after birth as having a longer term trajectory on their feeding journey. And that can be a very emotional and draining thing for people who have challenges with feeding. So if a mother was to have feeding problems after, that could cause relationship issues if they feel like mom and dad weren't on the same page. So you really need to talk about these things. And I think a lot of the conversations are about, you know, getting the baby out, which is also very important. But then once the parenting kicks in, there's very little talk about that. And I think we're doing a disservice, not just to dads, but to families and to relationships as well, when we don't have some of those conversations or talk through, okay, maybe some decision trees about scenarios. If you're dealing with this, would you be comfortable with this? Or, how would you manage that? So I think that kind of prep is really important, and doing it in a way that's positive. That's not necessarily scaremongering, around surgery and things like that. Like, there are lots of things that can happen, but yeah, so that would be my feeling around that we're not setting ourselves up for getting off on the best foot at times.
One thing I notice anecdotally is dads almost preemptively dismissing their own needs out of guilt. Like, she's doing the real work, I can't complain. Did that show up in your research at all?
Yeah. So guilt, I was really surprised, because we've come across this term mom guilt or mum guilt or whatever you want to call it. It's quite common. And I was quite surprised that there was such a strong sense of dad guilt or kind of managing of their own feelings. And I think the message, if I had one message to get out there, and I have this conversation a lot, because when people ask, what are you researching? And I'll say, I'm researching parenting or parenting services. Or sometimes I'll say, researching dads and transition to parenthood. Oh, why are you talking about that? Sure, it's fine for the dads. It's the mums that have to do all of the work. And the truth is, you can support both parents, and expressing your feelings as one parent is not diminishing the feelings as the other parent, So just because dads say, this is rough or I find this hard, doesn't mean they can't equally acknowledge, well, this is obviously physically very challenging for you. One thing doesn't negate the other. Like, we're not trying to one up each other. That's not what it's about. And
it's not a zero sum game.
No.
Yeah.
And it's the same with the services. Like, if you say, I think there should be more for dads, that's not to say something should be taken from mothers and given to fathers. And it's also not to say, that it's to help the dads. It is to help dads, but actually healthy mothers and healthy fathers and happy mothers and happy fathers make happy families. So, if we can support everybody, it's going to be good for everybody. So it's not trying to rob Peter to pay Paul, basically. And I think we have a bit of that mentality.
Yeah, I agree. I think, that probably leads into the title of your paper and the term passenger parenting. So could you explain exactly what does passenger parenting mean?
Passenger parenting, after reading through and having all the conversations with the fathers and reading through their narratives and studying them, I realized that there was this big sense of, this is a really big thing for me. I'm trying to carve out this role. But I noticed that some of the dads that wanted to carve out a bigger role kind of struggled. And there was a lot of grappling with maybe having to take a back seat and not necessarily making the work arrangements that they wanted to so they could spend more time with the kids, or kind of feeling a bit forced into this breadwinning role, or maybe feeling a bit like they were always that secondary parent when actually they loved it so much they just wanted to do more and spend more time. And then with the other dads that seemed to be a bit more content, there was a sense that they had kind of accepted or taken on this role of, look, my main role is to support my partner. And if I can kind of manage her needs, that will kind of work well for the family. And yes, I do actually want a better work-life balance, family versus work balance in the future. But I won't mention that right now. But if it crops up with another child in the future, I might mention it then, because that seems like a natural time to bring it up. But I'm definitely not going to bring that up now. And so it was this sense of, I want this role, but I'm really kind of taking a step to the side because I don't want to get involved in a power struggle or feel like I'm not supporting my partner. And so this notion of kind of the power imbalance and the passenger seat and the passenger parenting. And it kind of perpetuates those stereotypes that mothers are the leaders and fathers are the followers, but actually there's a lot more kind of thinking and subtlety around it than you might think. It's not just, the continuation of kind of historical roles. There's actually a bit of a push and a pull with that for fathers, I think, and it's quite subtle.
What do you think when couples maybe speak about, maybe not you're obviously using the terms passenger parenting, but they speak about those roles in advance, but then, and they want that equality side of things, but then they sort of drift into that more traditional style when it's actually happening? Why do you think that might be the case?
It's so hard to not drift into that. I mean, I see it myself all the time. And firstly, I think mothers get judged if something isn't done well. And I mean, I can give you the most simple example of this is, when my husband is taking my kids to school, I'm totally outing him now, but, he doesn't care whether they've got their hair brushed or not. He's like, oh, you've got your lunch, you got your bag, you got yourself, get out the door. Yeah, fine. And I am thinking, we need to get a brush through that hair, like you're unkempt. And honestly, if I'm completely honest, I'm thinking, I'm going to be judged as a mother if you rock up to school, whereas he won't be, And I feel that, and that's not his fault. And maybe it's my fault for not managing that. And that might not even be happening. But I feel like there's a little seed of, I'm not measured against the same measuring stick here as he might be. And another example is, as I mentioned, I'm from Ireland originally, and we'll often visit home as a family and take, trips, and I'll have squirreled away all of my rec leave or maybe some long service leave, and we'll take this trip, and my husband will come, and he does lots of cooking, and, he's very active in our household. And my auntie said to me, she came in and she visited at my mom's house one day, and she said, oh, well, because I sat down and I gave her all of my attention. And I just started making tea, and it might have been coming up to dinner time or something, or starting to cook dinner. And, I don't know when I'll see her again. I might see her maybe once or twice during this trip, and I might not see her again for a few years. So when people come around, I just drop everything and give them my attention, and I want to have the chats, and I make tea. And she said, oh, your husband he's just doing the cooking, and now the children are asking him for something. And this had gone on. Like, she's mentioned this a few times. And then she said, do you know how lucky you are? Do you know how lucky you are? And I'm thinking, and I mean, I work in academia, right? So it's a fairly education, as you will know. It can be a demanding job. There's lots to do. So, I've worked really hard to close out projects and to finish all of my teaching and do everything before I go on this trip. So we're often exhausted by the time we go, And I've worked so hard for this, and I'm giving you my attention because I really value this auntie relationship. And because I haven't maintained a facade of I do everything, I prepare all the meals, which I don't, might I add, I don't. I keep getting told that I'm so lucky. And there is an undercurrent of me feeling like, I think they think I'm a bit lazy here. I think that's probably at play. And so that kind of feeds in a little bit then to how I manage scenarios. And it's hard to give over the reins when you feel like you might be judged for doing that from the other side. And likewise, so we did a study then on stay-at-home dads, with a couple of colleagues of mine and a student, and she interviewed stay-at-home dads, and they were getting so annoyed with being praised for babysitting, Oh, you're so good. You have your, where's your wife today? Or where's their mother today? Or you're babysitting today? And, a lot of mothers have high pressure jobs, or are just taking a break from parenting at home most of the time and taking a well-earned break, or whatever it is they're doing. They could be at home doing laundry or all sorts of things. We don't know, depending on the household. But there is undercurrents of this judgment, even though you're trying really hard to move away from those stereotypes. And it's
Yeah,
really hard.
it takes time,
not-
doesn't it?
It does, yeah. So I don't know if you've experienced that, but I find it really hard not to kind of get sucked into that.
It's just like that social pressure that's out there. It's hard to put your finger on, but it exists. So it's a quite a hard one to, if you try and remove yourself completely from that, you're a social creature, so it's hard to disconnect from that.
Yeah, because we're not doing this in isolation, right?
No, exactly. Yeah.
So we're doing this in the social system we're in. The other one thing that I thought that was quite interesting that kind of ties in with this, when dads were talking about, and as we spoke about at the start, Australia is getting more progressive in terms of having more time that parents can take and dads can take after, having a child. A lot of dads pointed to the fact that they felt comfortable taking the parental leave or taking the allowances that were available to them at work if somebody else had done it before them. But if other people didn't, other dads didn't tend to take those allowances, they felt like, oh, I better not, because I might be seen as this notion of kind of the lesser worker, the not so great employee, like the needy employee. So feeling the pressure to actually keep up this kind of perfect productivity and show up and not look for those allowances. Whereas I think it maybe depends on which organization you work in and that kind of thing, but they did point to kind of having role modeling as an important part of feeling comfortable with doing those kinds of things.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So, you see that obviously with a lot of mums these days where they either feel they want to go back to work because they want to go back to work, or they feel the pressure to go back to work because, they might get left behind, or maybe they want to stay at home. So it's obviously quite a lot going on there for mums and dads, which is very complicated.
Yeah, I think there's more space for mothers to kind of change their mind. So the dad said, my partner thought she'd want to stay at home for, X number of months or years or whatever it was. But then she realized actually she was kind of missing that social element of work and missing feeling productive in that way and wanted to go back sooner. And I'm happy to support that and do what I can. So you would find then that some dads would kind of maybe change their work pattern a little bit, or maybe go, ever so slightly part-time to kind of facilitate some of these changes to their setup. But in situations where they thought, actually, I'd like something different, they just thought, oh no, I won't talk about that. We might talk about that maybe with the next child, but that's not really important right now. And it would be similar as well, where if mothers were working and wanted to take a bit more time, work the other way as well. But being a bit more flexible to mothers changing kind of preferences as they kind of adopted their new role, but really not offering the same forgiveness to themselves, and feeling like their job is to kind of be the stoic person. I've signed up for this. I'm not going to look for any kind of allowances or adjustments or anything. I'm just going to push on.
The mentioning the sort of stoic, I guess, tendency or leaning, I guess, with that, but I would say myself included, but a lot of maybe people that you see in the world, social media sort of thing, you see that, I guess, a lot of fathers and men very comfortable and forthcoming with giving support and trying to provide for, family, other people in their lives, but not being overly comfortable reaching out and trying to, ask for support when they need it. What stood out in terms of that, I guess, crying out for help if they needed it side of things in your research?
Yeah. So that was a tricky one. And mental health definitely reared its head. And I thought that was, I was really taken aback by some of the accounts of that, actually. And I was taken aback because I asked some really broad questions, right? This wasn't a study about mental health. And I was just asking, can you tell me about what it was like, becoming a parent, and tell me a bit about your story, like really broad questions. And I just let people tell their story. And I was really stunned that I think almost all of the participants kind of framed their story through a mental health lens. And people talk about fathers like not maybe, even when their mental health is challenged, they kind of talk about them maybe or frame it in a way where men don't really realize what's going on, but actually I think men are hyper aware of, their feelings and experiences in that way. But I think that sense of the need to stay stoic, like we spoke about, really kind of overriding a lot of that need to address their own well-being as well. But there was some really positive things. So it wasn't all doom and gloom. And firstly, there was some people that talk about having mental health challenges prior to becoming a parent, and then realizing the stress of parenting really kind of triggered some of that stuff again, but had already tapped into some health services and appreciated that they needed to continue engaging with those. But then we had other dads that spoke about like it being quite challenging, with this need to be stoic and need to be a great supporter of their partner, and then not necessarily reaching out to mental health services all the time, but developing really good coping mechanisms. And some of the ones that were, and they're just simple things, but something that cropped up was exercise. And they thought, if I can get to the gym or if I can do a bit of exercise, I can handle anything. And that really rang true for the men. So I thought that was really interesting. And, there's obviously links between, exercise, nutrition, and mental well-being and so on. We know all of these things, but, when you're in the fog of parenting, sometimes we don't always do what's best for us, and I'm certainly as guilty of that as the next person. But the dads really, really valued exercise. So I think that would be a message that I would give to parents, we know you're time poor, but in those early days, even if it's just to go out for a walk with the baby in the pram for 20 minutes, or, if you're a runner, just try and get that run in. Hey, you might not be able to spend as much time as you normally did, right? But if you can get a few Ks in a couple of times a week, that might really help you, to try and plant those seeds of things that could practically help. I think, that would probably be a bit more helpful than just honing in on birth and, this birth, because that's over in a day, or for most people, right? But this is a long game. Yeah. And we don't give many tools for the long game. And the other one then, and again, it's kind of the classic, getting out of the house. And we know getting out of the house is really important, like social connection. It's so good for our mental health and our well-being, but finding ways that it's still possible to kind of get out of the house and meet some friends. But for dads, it was interesting because, they spoke about friendships and, those friendships change and their capacity to go out, for example, to have a nightlife and whatever that looked like for individuals. For a lot of them, it wasn't there anymore. But then they spoke about kind of adapting to that and maybe having a few hobbies where that was built in, and that being really important. And if I think about my own situation, like our social lives have changed absolutely dramatically since becoming parents. But my husband loves trivia, so he goes to a trivia night one night a week, and it's just built in. It's a thing, he disappears after dinner on a particular night of the week, and he likes that, and it's kind of a routine thing, and it's a bit of an outlet with a bunch of people. But it can be as simple as that. It doesn't have to be a massive night out or, expensive, or, you don't have to have a massive boys' weekend. Like the snippets of social activities, if you can sprinkle some of those in, so that they're kind of part of your normal routine, I think it really helps with kind of your mental well-being.
Yeah,
and so
definitely, I would agree with literally everything you just said there from a personal side of things. So the exercise, if I made sure, and I was very lucky that my wife supported me to get to the gym those couple of 2 or 3 times a week, especially the first sort of year after my son was born, and I found that a really big benefit for me personally, like mentally, but also just, physically. And then the change in sort of like I guess it's the big shift of your social life, because where you could sort of just on a whim organise something, catch up with a friend beforehand, whereas has to look a lot different nowadays. But those sprinkles, I think, is a really good point to add in, where even if it's literally you out for a walk with the baby, just calling a friend for 10 minutes. That even, I think, made a big difference for me. It was a lot of my friends didn't have or haven't had children yet at the same life stage, which makes it a bit trickier too, where that sort of disconnect where you can talk to them about it, but you know they don't actually they don't get it the same as other parents would, which is no fault of their own. You just don't know what you don't know a lot of the time.
They'll be back.
But I think that's a really
asking you questions. A lot of them probably
laugh at them in the future. But yeah, no, I think that's a really, and particularly for dads, because that seems like I guess it's simple enough that they can sort of, it's an easy-ish thing to try to squeeze in. It's still tricky sometimes, depending on the situation, but it's not too dissimilar to what they might have been doing previously in some ways. Did you, I mean, like more on a personal level, how did your husband find the transition?
How did my husband find it? I think he found it exhausting. You know, we've got 2 children, and our second child didn't sleep, normally for about 5 years. And we were so tired. And if we had had him first, we would have said, gosh, I'm really bad at this. What am I doing wrong? Like, this one's broken. Like, but so it was tough. It was really tough. And then I suppose you haven't, and like a lot of people in Australia, given that, it's a vast geographic space, you don't necessarily have extended family to kind of give you a bit of a dig out. There's nobody coming over to say, oh, Norma, have a shower and have a coffee. I'll cuddle the baby here while you're doing it. There was none of that. So I was very dependent on him. And so I think I put a lot of weight on him, and he coped very well with that. But I wouldn't say he would say it was easy. I think he found it tough. And so I think that's what he would say. I'm speaking for him now, but like the sleep deprivation is just really hard for some people. And I know not everybody goes through that. But another interesting thing, out of all the dads that I spoke to, that I interviewed, one dad, and this is definitely something that would be a takeaway. There was one dad that said they had a good baby that slept. Everybody else said they were exhausted. So if there's anybody out there thinking, what's wrong with me and why can't my baby do the right thing? Just know a lot of us have been in that boat, and most people will struggle with this, if not throughout, at some point. There'll be pockets of it for everybody, I think. And if you meet a family that never had any of these dramas, I think they've got unicorn children. So you're not doing anything wrong. They're all different. Both of mine were very different. Yeah, I think that would be my takeaway.
I mentioned too, so I got a 2.5-year-old son, and then we have another baby on the way due in September. And my son's been a horrible sleeper, so most of his life, which
you know what you're getting to.
We're hoping that we've got that out of the way, and then the next one might be better. But on the flip side, you sort of trying to see a silver lining in it. You do, when you get through that sort of side of things, you're like, oh, geez, we can actually get through things that we didn't think that we could have beforehand. Like you learn your own resiliency to a degree, I think. And that's one little benefit, I think, of having a poor sleeper.
Yeah, I think parents are made of tough stuff. The things you kind of take on as a parent, you do learn your own resilience, and we can do a lot of hard things, actually. And I feel like before having children, I was kind of in a childlike state myself, that I really became an adult kind of after having children, like the weight of that responsibility. And I think for dads especially, that idea of, I'm responsible now and I need to provide now. It's totally groundbreaking. And the sleep deprivation mixed in with that. But like you say, we can do really hard stuff, and we can do it well, actually. But, we do need to be given a bit of grace to learn how to do it and to make mistakes. And to be kind to the other parent as well when we're making mistakes, which we're all guilty of, when we're tired or the other parent isn't doing things the way we might. Not necessarily being super supportive, But if you can kind of take a step back and go, actually, everybody's fed. Nobody's unsafe here. And, there's more sleep to be had. We'll be okay, I think,
Yeah.
It's all
like
good.
you said, that early stage is a bit of a haze. So you sort of, it's trying to see through the fog, and you're not really thinking straight with, where you sort of, where you're at personally, but then as a couple and a family, and it's a bit of a minefield.
Yeah. And you mentioned the couple, couple and the relationships. You mentioned the relationships. I thought that was really interesting because the men spoke about their own mental health, but they also started recognizing issues with their partner's mental health as well. And how that fed into their relationship. So that's quite interesting too, because the men are positioned kind of front and center to actually see how the mother is getting on and how they're going, and often they'll be, the number one confidant, but they're not actually upskilled in terms of recognizing, say, for example, if somebody is showing signs of postnatal depression or that kind of thing. So I think, we need to give the dads some tools as well to recognize, actually, this is sleep deprivation, having a bad day, versus this is actually, you're not thinking like your normal self. I think, you might be a bit flat here over a longer period. Maybe, we should talk to somebody about that, or how they might go about navigating that situation. I think is really important.
I think that's where maybe some type of, because obviously we have the regular baby checkups after birth, they reach the milestones and they make sure that, they're ticking all the boxes and everything. But then even obviously if it's a single parent or if it's a couple, having some type of check-in that's after the fact, because I'm done about your experience, but you sort of, you get home, you've got a baby, you didn't have a baby before that, and then you're like, oh, what do we do now? For the future, you've got to figure it out a lot, and having a little bit more support or just guidance available would be a good way to try and help not just the fathers but everyone.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's, mothers have an assessment as well, as part of the maternal child health checkups where their mental health is looked at. And that same assessment isn't offered to men typically, and we often know as well, men, they don't tend to tap into GP services, for example, as early as women, like women do for contraceptives and stuff like that. So we kind of naturally end up going to the doctor for various things, whereas often guys won't. And so it can be later in life. So they don't really have that existing relationship or pattern of kind of help seeking. And I think, a great thing to do would be, if you're getting ready to have your baby, actually make an appointment with your GP and talk to them about it. And you know what? It might be, depending on your health and things like that, if you're somebody that's never had their cholesterol checked or had any sort of physical, just a bit of a check-in and see how physically you're going, and kind of just breaking the ice would be a really good thing to do, because if the mother is having a 6-week checkup, maybe the dad could have one as well and talk to their GP and maybe have those conversations where if they're not coping all that well, that they might get a bit of help or tap into some services that would help them rather than suffering in silence, And again, that won't be necessary for everybody, but I think if we had better routines for everybody, those people that get a little bit lost would be better supported.
Yeah.
So I don't know about you, but the best support I have found for myself as a parent is I still remember the people who brought me lasagna. And, if there's anybody that's listening to this that wants to help somebody, it is the best gift, I think. I don't know what other people think, but, I'll never forget that and the friends who brought a meal. And it was just so helpful when you're tired and, you don't want to have to think about cooking or what's for dinner. It's just such a nice gift.
Yeah, I agree. That's a big one. We lived on frozen meals for a little while, early days. Yeah. So it's definitely a huge help.
Yeah.
That's so probably getting towards the end, that point that you just raised about, maybe the dad trying to get a checkup even beforehand, or just creating that starting point of the relationship, maybe with a healthcare provider. But if there was any expecting dads listening to this tomorrow, what would you sort of want him or them to actually do before the baby arrives?
I think having the chats at work, chat to other dads at work to see how they kind of navigated parenthood and taking time off, and who takes time off if the baby is sick, for example, when both parents go back to work. How do they manage their leave, that kind of thing. You might find, some people have more traditional approaches to things and might not have much to offer. But if you can find somebody that's kind of, maybe just a couple of years into their journey, if they've got any tips, I think that would be really good as well. Because I think you get a bit more confident about navigating these things if you know Tom down the road, or Tom and, finance, give me this advice. And that was, I feel like we've got similar values. I might try that too. I think, getting that bit of peer advice. And look, you might talk to Tom and go, I don't know what Tom's on about. I'm never doing that. And that's equally as helpful, I mean, Tom could be carving his own path, and that's fine. But I think having the conversations are really good. So just have lots of chats with people. And I mean, I think as well also to be mindful that people love scaremongering. So I do recall, somebody coming up to me when I was very close to giving birth saying, I think I was out with my friends and we've been swimming at the pool, and they said, oh, well, enjoy this now, because it's going to be terrible after you have the baby. Like, you're never going to get out and to do this older woman in the change rooms. And I thought, gosh, that was a bit harsh. And also she was wrong. So people love kind of projecting. And, even though I said there, like, one of my children was a terrible sleeper, I love him to bits. And he's the guy that gives me, cuddles. He comes into our room and he gives me cuddles. And I just cherish those now, because I know it's a window. In a few years' time, he'll be a teenager and, less emotionally available to me. So I am just soaking all of that up. And I think surrounding yourself with people that have positives, that'll talk about those, as well as some of the challenges, is good. Like you mentioned, it might be a good time to check in with the GP as well. And maybe developing some of those little habits, the sprinkles. So thinking about what that might look like for you, because it'll be different for everybody. And not everybody is a gym bunny, for example. But, most people will be comfortable going out for a walk with the pram, or, are you part of, a book club or a sporting team? Like, sport can be really great as well. And you get that sense of camaraderie. And so, if you can find something that isn't too absorbing, cricket could be problematic. Those games are very long, problematic for a new family. But, you might be able to go along to some training sessions or things that you feel like isn't too much of a burden on the family, but helps you mentally ticking over and feeling like you've got a bit of social outlet. I think that's really good for everybody. And it's good for your partner as well. You have something else to talk about other than, when did we last change the baby's nappy? Or when are we doing You've got something to talk about.
Yes, I used to be quite an avid golfer, but that's had to take a back seat for a while, because the hours commitment is hard to justify, and it just doesn't work. So, which is fine.
Golf's a tough one.
Yeah, definitely. So, maybe in another 10 years or 5 years or something.
You'll circle back.
Yeah, I'm hoping I can get my son out there with me, so that'll be fun.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. Probably, just wrapping up now, Norma. What do you mentioned it earlier on, but what are you working on currently, or what have you got in the pipeline?
What I'm working on currently. So I'm still very interested in transition to parenthood and dads and supporting parents. And at the moment I'm doing a PhD in complaints about birth care, actually. So it's through a slightly different lens, but actually looking at people's experiences of care providers during birth, and when things go wrong and when they try to seek redress or, answers, how is that managed and how is it dealt with? And it's in the backdrop of the New South Wales inquiry into birth trauma, which is, I think one of the biggest in the world. And they had 4,000 submissions from parents. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the stories that haven't yet been told, but also specifically looking at if you want to navigate that, and also help with the improvement of services moving forward for other parents. Where's the feedback going, and how can we support giving feedback or maybe making a complaint and having that managed well, so that parents leave the hospital or whatever setting they give birth in feeling like, okay, we've closed that chapter now, we're okay, rather than for some people taking a bit of trauma with them. And again, I suppose what we were talking about earlier was broader parenting stuff. Not everybody experiences birth trauma, and not everybody has a bad care experience as well. Just to add that in, if there's any new or prospective parents listening, that they're not getting scared off. And there's lots of wonderful birthing services in Australia. But yes, so that's what I'm looking at the moment.
Yeah, great. Very interesting. Well, yeah, I'd be keen to have a chat about that someday too. So
yeah, sounds good.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Norma.
Thanks, Aidan.
I've definitely learned a lot from looking at your research, but then you've very good at communicating what you found, which makes my job easy.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, and all the very best for your new arrival.